So are you getting the live stream?
I got it now.
Okay, and Becky, are you getting, I guess I have to go full screen on the YouTube thing in order to get it shared fully.
I'm not on YouTube at this point.
All right. Tom, can you see the full screen now?
I got it now. I'm all set with YouTube.
Okay. I'm gonna.
Good morning. Welcome to First Parish in Needham, a Unitarian Universalist congregation founded in 1711 along with the town of Needham. We are a proud LGBTQ welcoming congregation, climate justice seeking green sanctuary, and a level 2 sanctuary supporting Congregation for Immigration Justice. Whoever you are, whatever your background, and wherever you're watching from, you are welcome here. My name is George Ganacanto. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and my wife and I have been part of First Parish for 7 years. In that time, we have taught RE and coming of age classes to our youth. We have enjoyed stimulating conversations in Big Question Forum, found reflective opportunities in small group, and for the past 2 years, we have been a member of the Reparations Task Force. The journey into our UU past has been enlightening. Choosing to cast a light upon our UU history has reminded me of the importance of facing and then reconciling with our past. Learning that our first minister was a slaveholder was a sombering moment for me. Yet, it prompted me to ask more questions. Is this stain upon our congregation still with us today? Now that we know this about ourselves, how do we carry it? Can it be repaired? If you would like to engage in these and other related questions, please think about joining us in our journey to learn more about our past so that we can form a better sense of who we are in the present. As you know, what's happening right now at the congregation is very different than usual because of COVID-19. Although our building is closed, our faith community is open. We hope that all will plug into our Zoom gathering opportunities throughout the week, including Zoom social hour after every Sunday service. You can learn more about what's happening at First Parish by going to our website, uuneedham.org, or following us on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. To get the Zoom links, please sign up for our email newsletter by going to our website and clicking Get Involved, Newsletter, or sending your request by email to office@uuneedham.org. Our sincere hope is that these online services and connection opportunities will help us keep the physical distance required during this pandemic without losing much of the spiritual, emotional, and social closeness that we treasure in our faith community. If you are watching this service as it live streams, please take a moment to say hello and introduce yourself in the YouTube or Zoom chat box. Welcome again to everyone, and good morning.
We light the chalice, symbol of our Unitarian Universalist faith, with the words of Elizabeth Freeman. Any time while I was a slave, if 1 minute's freedom had been offered to me, and I had been told that at the end of that minute I must die, I would have taken it, just to stand 1 minute on God's earth, a free woman.
Good morning. Please join in from home with muted microphone as we read our unison covenant. We gather as a loving community to encourage and comfort one another. We gather as a diverse community to support each other in our search for spiritual truth. We gather as a service community to live our beliefs through action and care for our world.
When Israel was in Egypt's land, let my people go. Oppressed so hard they could not stand, let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh let my people go. The Lord told Moses what to do. Let my people go. To lead the tribe of Israel through. Let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. For you the cloud shall clear the way. Let my people go. A fire by night, a shade by day. Let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. We need not always weep and moan. Let my people go. And where the slavery chains forlorn, let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go.
Good morning. I'm Linda Davis, and this morning I'm going to read a few words from the reflections of William Ellery Channing. Slavery is a strange element to mix up with free institutions. It cannot but help to endanger them. It is a prescription for every kind of wrong. The slave brings insecurity on the free. Whoever holds one human being in bondage invites others to plant the foot on his own neck. Not one being can be wronged with impunity. The liberties of people ought to tremble until every man is free, and tremble they will. Their true foundation is sapped by legalized degradation of a single innocent man to slavery. That foundation is impartial justice, in respect for human nature, and respect for rights of every human being.
Good morning. I am Cece Ganacanto. Our congregation has been supported by the volunteer time and treasure of its members and friends since its founding in 1711. In those 300 years, this community has seen some tough times, but we are still here. This is the time in our service when we, the modern stewards of this church, offer to give what we can to build and sustain a world that we envision. For the entire summer, our plate collection will be divided equally between First Parish in Needham and the Needham Community Council, a local nonprofit group which runs, among other things, our local food pantry. Its customer list has dramatically grown during the pandemic. Our neighbors are depending on this service now more than ever. To donate to today's offering, you can use one of 3 different methods. For those of you with a smartphone, you can use our new text-to-give program. Just put in the phone the number 73256 and text to that number UU Needham space plate space, then the $sign with the amount you'd like to give, all in one message. If you want your money applied to your pledge, please text instead that same phone number 73256 with UU Needham, pledge 21 or pledge 22, depending on whether you want it applied to the fiscal year just completed or the new fiscal year. Follow that with a $sign and the amount you'd like to give. If you'd prefer to mail First Parish a check, please make it out to First Parish in Needham, put the date of this service and the word collection in the memo line. Alternatively, if you want the money applied to your pledge for either the fiscal year just finished or the upcoming year, put FY21 or FY22 in that memo line instead. The last and perhaps easiest method is to use our website, uuneedham.org, to make your donation. There is a giving button in the upper right-hand corner with a drop-down menu where you find an entry labeled Donate Now. Following that link and signing into your Realm account, you'll be able to fill in your donation information and choose a recipient fund for its destination, such as plate collection. Thank you for everything you are able to give to help support and sustain this congregation and the vital work of our community partners. Please take these few moments to give what you can, and please know that it will be gratefully received. Thank you, and have a good Sunday.
I'm here to introduce Caleb with Curls. This kid is amazing. This is a time for all ages. And what I'm going to invite kids to do who might be listening today is there's going to be a bunch of names at the end of really cool Black and Indigenous people that I think you guys should be knowing about. There might be some kids' books out there, and parents. The kids are going to teach you about these folks because I really think everybody should know about them. One guy actually was even the first person to introduce vaccines to the Boston area in the smallpox. Onesimus. There was Crispus Attucks, who was actually from the native praying Indians, and he was the first person to die in the American Revolution in the Boston Massacre. And the other person I'm going to ask you to watch out for is Peter Salem from Framingham, and Elizabeth Freeman's neighbor, Agrippa Hull, and of course, Elizabeth Freeman. So here comes Caleb with Curls telling you what he thinks about Elizabeth Freeman, and it's awesome.
Hi everybody, it's me, Carol Girl.
Why?
Hi everybody, it's me, Campbell Curls. And today we're learning about a Black history hero named Freeman who made herself a free woman. She was saucy, feisty, bold, brave. Elizabeth Freeman was one of the most successful abolitionists of the 18th century. Clearly she means business. She grew up in Massachusetts as a slave before the United States of America was even a country. She often heard her owners talking about being free from British rule and becoming an independent country. In her home, she overheard conversations about Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. How as a part of this new nation, all men and women are created equal and were given rights from the Creator, Jesus, God, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Remember I said that. This is important later. So when she was about 39 years old, she and her owner got into it. She was over it and ran away. She went straight to see a lawyer named Theodore Sedgwick to have a talk about her freedom. She felt like the Declaration of Independence and the new Massachusetts state constitution were clear. She said, "Dude, I'm free." And he said, "We're all right." He argued in a Massachusetts court that Miss Elizabeth should be free like everyone out. That judge was so impressed by the argument, he agreed and said that the new laws in Massachusetts meant that slavery was illegal in the entire state. So not only was Miss Elizabeth free, but all slaves in the state were also free. You girl. When you stood up for yourself, you lifted a whole lot of other people with ya. Elizabeth Freeman, courageous, committed, Black history hero. See you next time. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button on the bell to make it ring.
How many times are you gonna say it?
Mommy?
Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and ring that little bell in the corner. Peace!
Elizabeth Freeman, her story. History needs to be relatable and accurate, with both the understanding that how we interpret it can evolve over time. To quote Lin-Manuel Miranda from the show Hamilton, who lives, who dies, and who tells your story is really important. Perhaps one of the most important history lessons we will receive. History often is learned through court cases, laws, and Supreme Court decisions. Today, we will hear the backstory of the case of Brom and Bet versus Ashley, which originally was heard on August 21st, 1781. This is why we celebrate Elizabeth Freeman Day this weekend. American colonial history is more than the stories and writings of famous white males who are often Christian leaders and founding fathers. It is also about Black, formerly enslaved women who worked as housekeepers, herbalists, and midwives, like Elizabeth Freeman, or Agrippa Hull, one of 5,000 Black men who fought valiantly in the Revolutionary War, and who was Elizabeth's co-worker in the Sedgwick House. Many of us went to school at a time when great men, their intellectual thoughts, and their political doings equaled history. In our history books, it's as if the lives of Black, Indigenous, Asian, Muslim, Buddhist, Jews, Hindus, workers, farmers, dressmakers, midwives were invisible or weren't important enough to record. The challenge in our era is finding the recording of these lives to tell a fuller, more inclusive story from different perspectives. Sadly, we often find published accounts written in someone else's hand with very heavy editing or in a romanticized novelistic format. Unfortunately, most of Elizabeth Freeman's story does not come in her own words or hand, but in Catherine Sedgwick's. Thankfully, we have some documents like marriage, birth, and baptismal records that help us to trace personal histories. History, like voting, was reserved in this country for propertied white men. The stories of women, often wives, mothers, daughters, and aunts, are missing. Today, we are adding that to the story. We will never hear Elizabeth or her co-plaintiffs' words because the lawyers did all of the arguing, although we can get a glimpse into some of the others who filed freedom suits, like Quock Walker and other formerly enslaved people as far back as 1706, and even get a glimpse of the feelings and much more of the lives of enslaved people of Massachusetts.
I will speak of a woman who had 3 names and effectively 3 identities. Bet, her enslaver's choice of a name. Mumbet, the name the children she nannied for after their father helped her to win their legal suit. And finally, Elizabeth Freeman, the name she chose for herself upon leaving enslavement and the Ashley home in Sheffield. In her young adult book about Elizabeth Freeman, author Mary Wilde writes, Elizabeth left no letters of her own, no diaries, no first-hand clues to her thinking or her way of seeing the world. She did, however, leave a will in which she names herself Elizabeth Freeman, names her daughter, a granddaughter, a grandson, and 3 great-granddaughters. There is much inconsistency in the accounts of Elizabeth's life, but here is what we know. Bet was born in enslavement in Claverack, New York in 1744. There are varying accounts of how old she was when she came to live in Massachusetts, but we do know that a Dutch settler named Peter Hogeboom gave Bet and her sister Lizzie to his daughter Hannah upon her marriage to John Ashley of Sheffield. This was a common practice in the colonial era. Bet was either 7 or 14 at that time. Catherine Sedgwick's words are our primary path to knowing Bet's story. Catherine was one of 10 Sedgwick children. Mumbet raised because their mother, Pamela, suffered from depression. In Catherine's version of Elizabeth's life, Bet arrives in Massachusetts as an infant. Sedgwick paints the scene as a charming picture of little Bet, barely 6 months old, bundled up against the cold, lying on the bottom of a straw-filled sleigh, on her way to a new home in the middle of winter. If that infant was Bet, then she would have not had a younger sister with her. Could the baby have been her sister? Or if Bet were indeed 14, could it have been her own daughter, conceived the way many children of enslaved young women were? By violation. We simply do not know. Like many enslaved young women in New England, Bet was probably responsible for constant sweeping of floors, cleaning, dusting, and polishing. She would have had to cultivate, harvest, dry, and strew herbs against the house. She would have had to cultivate, harvest, dry, and strew herbs against fleas and house pests. Enslaved girls and women would carry water from wells, boil it in pots over a wood fire, split and haul the wood for the fire. They maneuvered pots of cooked or washed water without spilling or burns, or dresses catching the fire for wood for outside or inside for washing dishes. There were rows of dirt to be mounded, seeds to be planted, weeded, watered, and washed. Chickens to be fed, eggs to be collected, cleaning, cutting, slicing vegetables, cleaning and plucking feathers from the fowl and stuffing them, and roasting meats. There was tending to the missus and children, sewing garments, cleaning stains, changing bedclothes. The list goes on. Catherine Sedgwick tells a story that figures directly into the court case. One day, Lizzie was hungry, and either Bet or Lizzie took some food scraps for her. When Mrs. Hannah found out, she flew into one of her rages and attempted to strike Lizzie with a hot ladle or shovel from the fire. Bet intervened. Mrs. Hannah struck, and the hot ladle hit Bet on the arm. It was a deep wound that festered. In one account, the next day, Bet walked 4 miles to Theodore Sedgwick's house to ask for his help. The scar of the wound remained on her arm for the rest of her life. All that winter, Bet let people around town see the scar, She almost wore it as a badge of pride, and when they questioned what happened, she said, "Ask Mrs."
On Sunday afternoons during the good weather seasons, a large picnic basket would be filled, and the 7 Reynolds family members would set off from Richmond for an adventure. Whatever the chosen route, there was beauty at every turn. If southern Berkshire was decided upon, we'd motor down Route 41 through Great Barrington, and Mother would mention that W.E.B. Du Bois had grown up there, as though we should be aware of that. There was then a swing through Sheffield, Ashley Falls, and then heading back in the shadow of Monument Mountain, where we knew Melville and Hawthorne had hiked together. And then we were on the route to Stockbridge, just in time to listen to the evening selections from the children's chime tower at the Congregational Church, directly across from the cemetery. This cemetery had the famed Sedgwick plot. It was laid out like a wagon wheel of graves of the entire family. Homemade ice cream awaited us at home in Richmond, and we'd had a perfect tour. The Ashley house, where Bet was enslaved for decades, although moved down the road, is still standing. So is the Sedgwick home in Sheffield, where the Sedgwick family lived. Standing still is the Sedgwick brick mansion in Stockbridge, where the circular drive fronts the house. Reflect for just a moment of all the historic houses you have toured. How many times you've heard the stories of the Black and enslaved people who lived there? Probably not many, or if so, just in passing. In 1776, 216 Black people lived in the Berkshires. Not many of their dwellings remain. Only a nature trail where W.E.B. Du Bois lived, as beautiful as it is, that my mother often pointed out to us. His house was raised in the 1950s. One of the greatest thinkers in American history, certainly Black history. At the Red Lion Inn in Stockbridge, we speak of its Revolutionary War history. We speak of great presidents who stayed there, the famous musicians, and artists like Norman Rockwell, who lived and painted many in the town. But how often do we speak of this vibrant Black community, the Mohicans and Stockbridge Indians? It was a place like South Natick praying Indian community and the area on the outskirts of Concord, where Black and Indigenous families coexisted and lived their lives. And finally, how often do we speak about people like Elizabeth Freeman?
Good morning. I'm Vicki McCready's, and I'd like to tell you the story of Elizabeth Freeman's court case to win freedom for herself, her daughter Lizzie, and all the enslaved peoples in Massachusetts. I'm going to read from a children's book called Mumbette's Declaration of Independence by Gretchen Wolfelay, illustrated by Alex Delenius. We'll start after the Constitution of Massachusetts has been ratified. The town held a meeting to learn about the Massachusetts Constitution, the new law of the land. Mumbette slipped into the back of the hall. She couldn't see over the crowd, but she heard well enough. All men are born free and equal. Mumbette wrinkled her brow. Was this law meant for her? The next day, she picked up a shopping basket, but she walked past the store. Mumbette stopped at the crossroads. Perhaps her plan would fail, and Mrs. Ashley would treat her worse than ever. She would take that chance. She would go to the young lawyer with the fire in his eyes, Mr. Theodore Sedgwick. Mumbette, what are you doing here? He asked. Right then she made her Declaration of Independence. I want to be free. I've got a right to be free. Mr. Sedgwick's eyebrows shot up. What gives you such a notion? The new Constitution says so. All people are born free and equal, Mumbette replied. I am not a dumb creature. I deserve my freedom. Mr. Sedgwick rubbed his chin. I don't know. You wrote those freedom words at Colonel Ashley's house, she said. Do you believe them? Her blazing eyes met his. Of course, but that was not the law. The new Constitution is the law. Mumbette folded her arms. Yes, but he gazed at Mumbette, standing strong as a mountain, and pounded his desk. We will go to court together and test the new law. But if we lose, I will be no worse off, Mumbette said, and if we win, I will be free. A few days later, a loud knock sent Mumbette to the front door. Colonel John Ashley, said the sheriff, holding out a paper. Colonel Ashley read it and exclaimed, Give up Mumbette. She's my property. You know that. You refuse? Asked the sheriff. Of course I do. Good day then, Colonel, said the sheriff. Mrs. Ashley slammed the door. Mumbette hid a smile. Her fight for freedom had begun. Mumbette and Mr. Sedgwick entered the courthouse on a hot August day. The room was crowded with their neighbors. Colonel Ashley argued that he had owned Mumbette for many years. She was his servant for life. Mr. Sedgwick argued that even though people owned slaves in Massachusetts, no law had ever made it legal. Now, the new Constitution made it illegal. Mumbette was not anyone's servant for life. The jury and judge thought it over and agreed. Mambette was free, and so was Lizzie. I suppose I'll have to pay you wages now, snapped Mrs. Ashley. No, you won't, said Mambette. I'm quitting your house forever. Mambette returned to the courthouse one more time to choose two names for herself. From that day on, she was Elizabeth Freeman, and for the rest of her long life, she lived free as a river and strong as a mountain.
Despite the cruelties and restrictions of slavery, at least two enslaved women in Massachusetts, contemporaries of Elizabeth Freeman, became known for their poetry. Deliverance Page of Danvers and Phyllis Wheatley, who lived in Boston. These women led lives that were similar in many ways to Elizabeth Freeman's. Through their poetry, we learn how they felt about their enslavements. Elizabeth Freeman could not read or write, but we are told of her words by her biographer, Catherine Sedgwick. We do not know how these women felt about the families they worked so hard to care for, but we do know how they felt about freedom. Deliverance, or Dill as she was known, was enslaved by the Page family of Danvers. As a child in 1766, she was transported on a slave ship to Salem and purchased by Jeremiah Page, along with her mother, Combo, and older sister, Kate, for 58 pounds, 13.4 shillings. Enslaved children were raised with their enslavers' children, but Dill was most likely put to work early after the death of her mother and sister in 1768. She would have performed household duties and helped raise the other children. A white woman named Lucy Larcom refers to deliverance in an 1874 poem entitled The Gambrel Roof. Larcom was a friend of Anne Page, one of the Page grandchildren. In the poem, Larcom references Dill as Anne's grandmother Sarah's quote unquote black and romanticizes about the two women working together to prepare a fancy tea party. The party was held during the tea boycott during Revolutionary War times. Anne's husband had declared that none shall drink tea in my house. So the party was held on the roof. The reality is most likely that Dill shined all the silver, made the cakes, boiled the water, carried up all the chairs and tea set and service by herself, and may not have had any of the tea either. This is what Deliverance actually wrote about her enslavement. They stole us from Africa, the home of the free, and brought us in bondage across the sea. Deliverance's longing for the freedom of Africa is reminiscent of Phyllis Wheatley's thoughts that she expressed in a letter to the Reverend Samson Occam, a Mohegan praying Indian minister. According to Henry Louis Gates Jr., Wheatley's letter was published in the Connecticut Gazette on March 11, 1774, several months after she was freed. She wrote, "In every human breast, God has implanted a principle, which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance. And by the leave of our modern Egyptians, I will assert that the same principle lives in us." Here is how Phyllis Wheatley describes being a slave in a 1772 poem written to a British earl. "Should you, my lord, while you peruse my song, wonder from whence my love of freedom sprung, whence flow these wishes for the common good, by feeling hearts alone best understood, I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Afric's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breast. Steeled was that soul, and by no misery moved, that from a father seized his babe beloved. Such my case, and can I then but pray others may never feel tyrannic sway?" Elizabeth did not write her own words. Rather, they come to us through Catherine Sedgwick, who tells us, "I have heard her say with an emphatic shake of the head peculiar to her, anytime I was a slave, if 1 minute's freedom had been offered to me, and I had been told I must die at the end of that minute, I would have taken it. Just to stand 1 minute on God's earth, a free woman, I would.
Good morning, everybody. I just want to make sure that you all can hear me this morning. I'm a live part of this program. Why Elizabeth Freeman? And before I get on, I want to just sort of say I'm wearing blue and a white ruffle and a necklace in honor of Elizabeth Freeman. Elizabeth Freeman actually, when she passed, and we believe it was her late 80s, was a fairly well-off woman by the standards of the day. In her will, she left various things, lovely clothings and some velvet and a gold necklace. This is not gold. And she also left about $1,000 of an estate, which is quite a bit of money for the day. Elizabeth didn't live in singularity. And this is the really important thing. When we study American history, especially in this country, we study the history of the great men that George spoke of. This is not a country of history of great men. It is a country of history of community and collective that is so important in the traditional, many indigenous peoples like the Massachusetts here, the Natick-Crane Indian towns, people in Concord who would be Nipmuc, and out in Western Mass in the Stockbridge Mohican community that was moved to Wisconsin. All of these communities figure into the Elizabeth story. Elizabeth ended up being a midwife, a nurse, and obviously, as you saw, she cared for the Sedgwick children. Let's talk a little bit about that. After she found her freedom, she went to, and I'm sorry we don't have the pictures, work in large, beautiful homes of the Sedgwick family. She did all of the sorts of tasks, but this time with a wage, and this time with a modicum of respect. Pamela Sedgwick was very mentally ill, and one of the descendants of that family is actually Edie Sedgwick. So you can see this multi-generations of mental illness, and I would posit that maybe that mental illness came from birthing 10 children and some postpartum depression. We do not know, but think about it. And this figures in strongly to Elizabeth's story as a midwife and herbalist. And this really spoke to me. I will add that as a young woman, I studied the history. I was a history major in college, did some work in undergraduate on heritage studies. And I was often gravitated to the study of oppressed peoples, revolutions, people who stood up, women's history. So this is why Elizabeth speaks so strongly to me. And in my other years as an adult, I studied herbalism for about 30 years. And modern American herbalists, Black herbalists, are really reclaiming this tradition that women at Elizabeth's time existed and talked about and knew about, but probably only whispered about. Because let's think about who the most famous colonial era Black herbalist would have been. Any guesses? Tituba in the Salem witchcraft tribes. She is the only one who's known to us. She practices a religion called voodoo, and many of the women would have been 1 or 2 generations removed. We know that Elizabeth had a mother. One of the things that she has in her will is that she bequeaths her mother's short gown to her daughter Elizabeth. Imagine women who barely had anything from their mothers, how important that would be. The other thing that, according to an extraordinary woman who wrote Farming While Black, runs Soul Fire Farm, does so much work in the community, infused with ritual and spirit, because this is how midwifery was practiced in Europe, not Europe, excuse me, in Africa amongst indigenous peoples. And so a modern herbalist will say something, her name is Kendra Payne, and she says, as a Black herbalist, I knew my ancestors contributed to the world of herbalism in significant ways. Yet their information is missing. So much of this information is missing. We try to reclaim it, and honestly, it should not be me, a white woman, who's doing this reclaiming. Many incredible Black women are doing this reclaiming. So Leah Penniman talks about some of the herbs and what the women actually did when they knew enslavement was, the enslavers were nearby, the Black enslavers, the white enslavers in Africa. They actually took their hair and they braided in the seeds of their homeland. Things like black rice and gourds and mullein and so many other things, perhaps different kinds of pumpkins or yams and things like that. And they brought them with them over that horrible passage. Speak for a moment about the passage. 12.5 million people were stolen out of Africa. The people who enslaved them in this country are the very people who are writing these. Theodore Sedgwick, of whom we spoke to, who fought her case brilliantly, he actually enslaved another human being. And he purchased her in 1777. Her name was Tun. Back up for a moment. In 1773, Theodore Sedgwick is writing the Sheffield Resolves. These are the first statements by people that get written. They set the historic precedents for our own Suffolk Resolves that were written in Dedham, where the courthouse now sits, which was once a tavern. And they say, excuse me, I'm just going to look for the piece of paper of what they say. Be it resolved that mankind in a state of nature are equal and free and independent of each other and have a right to understand enjoyment of their lives, their liberty and property. Resolved that the great end of political society is to secure in a more effectual manner these rights and privileges wherewith God and nature have made us free. So someone who writes that 4 years later, a year after the Declaration of Independence, purchases another human being. A lot of dual realities that we have to wrestle with as modern day humans, Unitarians, Americans. As a matter of fact, more than half of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence were enslavers. Franklin, John Hancock, Josiah Bartlett of New Hampshire, Stephen Hopkins, all northern enslavers, Caesar Rodney as well. At the time, ultimately, we have about 5,000 enslaved people on the eve of the American Revolution in Massachusetts, about 2% of the population. In cities like in Rhode Island, South Kingston, 30% of the population is enslaved, 10% in Boston, about 9% in New London, and 7% in New York. What did these people do? How Northern slavery differs from the Southern slavery of the plantation system is many of these people were almost farmed out to work. And this starts early in the 1600s. The reason we show that body of liberty early on is that John Winthrop was one of the first to enslave people. And back then they were enslaving people who were massacred, leftover people who were massacred from the Pequot revolt. And 500 people, women and children, were burned in this Pequot war down in Connecticut. And one of our first governors enslaves one of those people. So when we talk about things like institutional racism, every institution that we have in this country was founded under enslavement. So what did some of the enslaved people do when they weren't doing the chores at home? Their enslavers would sort of farm them out. There were seamstresses, cooks, and chefs, coopers, sailmakers, stable hands. The rope works was really important. Blacksmiths, glaziers working on whaling ships, and sailors like Crispus Attucks. Brush workers, carpentry, and the list goes on. They would come home with a wage. They could keep some of it and maybe release themselves from freedom eventually by paying for themselves, kind of a bizarre concept, and they would give money to their enslavers. Ultimately, and I got the date wrong by the time I gave the information to George. In 1701, we see the first freedom case. And these are cases where the enslaved were freeing themselves. Like this whole notion of, oh, the master freed me. These people were in resistance, just like Leah Penniman's story of the women who were braiding seeds into their hair. Resistance. And these folks were, creating lawsuits based on a couple of things, either mistreatment or the enslaver promised me I would be free at 21. I'm now 29. Here's a lawsuit. But how Mom Bet or Bet's case is different is that she was in Sedgwick were not arguing based on the idea of mistreatment, even though that was a huge part of the case. And we talk about precipitating factors. As lovely as that children's book is, it's really not accurate to really what was going on. There are 5 precipitating characters. 1, this incredible, cruel slashing of this woman's arm, being terrified that her daughter would be sold or that she would be sold. Very real reality. Number 2, Bet is actually in the room when those Sheffield resolves are being written. She knows all the men in the room. And not only is she in the room where it happened, to quote Hamilton, she is serving these men who are writing all of these things and oblivious that there is an enslaved person while they're arguing for their freedom. Number 3, the Declaration of Independence is read in every hamlet and every town in New England. It still is. Number 4, John Adams in the Massachusetts Constitution. John Adams writes that all men are created free and equal. And number 5 are these freedom suits with people like Bob Walker. And so those are the contexts. When we get back, and I'll finish with this part here, when we get back to studying Black history and Indigenous history, it's so important that we take off the lens of the great white male, singular, heroic character and look at collectives. Look at the collective act, as Richard Jenkins, who just created the film, I really can hardly wait to see it, Underground, about the Underground Railroad. He says the greatest act of collective parenting was actually the parenting that all the enslaved people were doing to raise the Black children who were born into slavery. And of that, there's a lot of work being done to reclaim this, not much work historically on what was going on in the North. So how do we find some of this information? We look like we do to the next door neighbors, people like Agrippa Hull. People, and we look about how enslavement and some of the values that are still held today. And we look at the world of what Black midwives today and herbalists today are talking about. Now I said we'll go to Agrippa Hull, who was a Revolutionary War hero, lived next door to Elizabeth Freeman. This is Elizabeth Freeman's community. This is her collective. Black people who lived at this place called Negro Pond on the other side of Stockbridge. What was going on? How were these people training each other to be midwives? Agrippa Hull is a Revolutionary War hero. He becomes the wealthiest person in this town within the Black community, well respected by Black and white people. He was born free in Northampton, Massachusetts. He has an amazing story, and we worked with a student who looked at all of his revolutionary military. His discharge papers were signed by George Washington, an enslaver of 300 people. And his discharge papers, and there's a book written about him, the Polish Count Kosciuszko, whose name I don't pronounce well, Agrippa Hull, and Thomas Jefferson. That Polish Count made Jefferson promise, like a blood oath, that at the end of his days, he would release his enslaved people. Instead, they were auctioned off on the lawn of Monticello. So there's a lot that we have to reckon with, these dual stories of independence and liberty, with what these people were actually doing, enslaving their fellow human beings. So back to the midwives. what was going on there? Well, for midwives actually got money. And if we can show the picture of this actress portraying Elizabeth Freeman, think about what midwives are doing. They're actually bringing into the world what these white men are considering their property. So they're actually paying them a decent wage in order to do so. And there's a whole community of Black women who know, especially if the women are being raped, as how they became pregnant, they know abortifacients. Interestingly, it is the cottonseed. And they carried this cottonseed with them from Africa. And as Leah Penniman points out the real irony of this, cotton that came from Africa actually had a color to it. It was colored, as she said. It was pink and green and brown, whereas the white only cotton was the cotton that was preferred to be grown here. So cottonseed was an abortifacient. There were others, and they brought with them, and they talked to the indigenous women who were here, who taught them things like using sassafras, and then some of the white European herbs like mullein. And so they have this whole compendium of herbal knowledge that passes down to the herbalists and the midwives today. So we learn so much from Elizabeth Freeman. We learn courage and fortitude. We learn standing up for one's rights. I love that statue of Elizabeth. And this is why we celebrate her this weekend. But we also celebrate her legacy and the work she did in the world. And so I think it's really important that we all learn as much about as many of the Black lives, because they matter. We learn about them in history, and we learn about them from Black people. I hope that next year there is somebody who is Black, who either is from Africa or from this country, who is telling these stories, because I don't want it to be me. I think that it's time that we really make community as a church group with the Black people who live in this area and have more Black voices as part of our church community. If you could show the midwives and what they have to say about collective care, which is so important to us in these times, as well as to the Black and Indigenous communities that exist in this country. And so I hope that you enjoy hearing about Elizabeth, hearing about her story, and the people around her. And that we celebrate her, along with strong, young Black women who are working as herbalists, midwives, healing community, speaking of these traumas, these multiple traumas, and healing today.
I'm on my way to the freedom land. I'm on my way to the freedom land. I'm on my way to the freedom land. I'm on my way, great God, I'm on my way. I asked my sister, come and go with me. I asked my sister, come and go with me. I asked my sister, come and go with me. I'm on my way, great God, I'm on my way. I asked my brother, come and go with me. I asked my brother, come and go with me. I asked my brother, come and go with me. I'm on my way, great God, I'm on my way. If they say no, I'll go anyhow. If they say no, I'll go anyhow. If they say no, I'll go anyhow. I'm on my way, great God, I'm on my way. I'm on my way, and I won't turn back. I'm on my way, and I won't turn back. I'm on my way, and I won't turn back. I'm on my way, great God, I'm on my way.
As we close our worship today, please remember to keep a careful eye out for emails from First Parish or follow us on social media so you can keep up with opportunities for connection to your faith community. When today's service ends, you are invited to stay to our Zoom social hour. Hope to see you there. Please remember, if you fall ill or have any pastoral need, reach out to our pastoral care committee or caring crew via phone or email. We always extinguish our chalice with words promising to carry its flame in our hearts until we are together again. And I know that you and I and all of us are deeply committed to that promise, no matter how long it is until we are together again in person. As we extinguish our chalice today, please join me from home in saying these words by Unitarian Universalist minister, Reverend Elizabeth Sally Jones. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, nor the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
I think America is a place of optimism. You had to be an optimist to think that we could defeat one of the world's great powers and gain our independence. We would never have been able to win the Revolutionary War if it were not for the contributions of African Americans and Native Americans. And that wasn't always something that was pointed out in the history books that I had to deal with in the 50s and 60s. So I wanted to change that dynamic, and I think that that's what this should be about.
Fall 1781. Black patriot James Armistead has risked life and limb to deliver vital intel to the Continental Army, leading to Britain's surrender.
James Armistead is really celebrated by Lafayette and Washington because he provides critical information that leads to the victory at the Battle of Yorktown.
Armistead identifies so closely with the revolution, he will one day take the name of his celebrated French commander. But tragically, while the new nation has won its freedom, James Armistead Lafayette has not won his.
He applies for his freedom. He believes that the service that he's provided to the American Army has been crucial and that because of that, he deserves to be a free man. But he is told that because he was a spy and not a soldier, that his freedom is not something that is deserved.
The way that they tried to re-enslave James Armistead was very shameful. What he contributed to the efforts of the Continental Army cannot be minimized.
In the newly formed United States of America, slavery is still legal and a way of life, especially in the South. where many black soldiers are denied their freedom, just like James Armistead. But in the North, the seeds of abolition are already sprouting, thanks to the courage of an enslaved woman named Mum Bet, who fights her war of independence in a Massachusetts courtroom.
She takes this idea of natural equality that's embedded in the state constitution of Massachusetts and says that this applies to me. And if all men are actually born free and equal, then I cannot be enslaved. And the court in Massachusetts agrees.
In victory, Mum Bet changes her name to something new and entirely fitting: Elizabeth Freeman.
She's not the only person that does this. There are men whose surnames are Freeman and Liberty and Self. And how powerful is that to think about these people of African descent who are literally trying to claim this status with their names?
Her court case, her ability to win her freedom, would prompt all kinds of legislation for the future. It became the legal bedrock of abolition.
In my eyes, if it's possible for the entire African-American experience during the Revolutionary War to be summed up in one quote, it's something Elizabeth Freeman once said.
Anytime while I was a slave.
If 1 minute of freedom had been offered to me,
and I had been told I must die at the end of that minute,
I would have taken it, just to stand 1 minute on God's earth, a free woman.
I would.
I would.
I would.
Amazing.
Honestly, I'm kind of speechless. She really meant it. She really meant it. And I think it just says something about the depth of loss and the feeling that there is something out there that's so precious that even to grasp it for a moment is better than to be deprived of it interminably.
Elizabeth Freeman's own words remind us what was at the center of the American Revolution and of life for Black men and women living in the 18th century, that freedom was always on everyone's mind.
What Blacks have contributed to make America a great nation are very significant, and I hope that we can get to the point where everybody's contributions will matter. Thomas Jefferson's contributions will matter, and Crispus Attucks' contribution will matter. And that's how it should be, because this is one nation. And I hope that we can continue to build it.